the only way to kind of evolve and really understand what's happening in the operation, and whether it be from an internal operation perspective or from a guest perspective, is having strong data, right? I grew up in restaurants, and it was always that, the mantra was always cash is king.
Uh-huh.
But I think data is a close second to that, right? Because the only way to drive your business forward is by having actionable information that you can really make a decision and influence change off of.
What's up, Zach Oates here, author, entrepreneur, and customer relationship guru. Welcome to Give An Ovation, growth strategies for restaurants and retailers, where we find industry leaders to share their secrets to grow your business. This podcast is sponsored by Ovation, the actionable guest feedback tool that works on or off premise and is easy, real-time, and actually drives revenue. Learn more at ovationup.com. Welcome to another edition of Give An Ovation. This is actually a special edition. We are having a conversation around technology in the new normal. Now, joining us today, if you don't know Kelly McPherson, I am so excited. And if you know Kelly McPherson, you are probably so excited. Kelly McPherson is a 30-year restaurant veteran, former CIO of Burger King, Tim Hortons, Popeyes, led technology for Micros, Abercrombie & Fitch, Hard Rock Cafe, got her start in Planet Hollywood. And if this is reading like the dream of whoever you want to have on your team, it's true. And we are so happy that Kelly is now part of the Ovation team. We're super excited about that, especially because Kelly pioneered receipt surveys before that was even a thing. So Kelly, super excited to have you not only on the team, but also on this podcast so that we can talk about technology. So thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Zach. Super excited to be here.
So one of the things that we had a conversation about recently was how you go back to the history of restaurants. Really, it starts, our modern concept of a restaurant starts arguably right after the French Revolution. Call it 200 years ago ballpark, where restaurants and customers, they kind of, over the last 200 years, we've been evolving this set of expectations. And it's been very similar for the last 200 years. And now everything is starting to become different. This concept of a new normal, whether or not you love or hate that term, the fact is that there is a new normal, and that technology is playing a part in this, in what that new normal is. So let's jump into it, Kelly. What are some tips? What are some thoughts that you have for restaurant owners and operators as they're emerging into this new normal?
Yeah, it's, I think that the important part is, I think new normal has become the biggest, the new buzzword. I think pre-COVID it was Omni-Channel, which I still think is relevant today. But when you look at it, the new normal is coming, but I think the biggest part of it is it hasn't been defined yet, right? And so when we start talking about how technology can kind of serve up and help the restaurant operations during kind of this transition phase or this discovery phase, is making sure that it's adaptable and you don't really try and overthink it right away, because, chances are, change is going to be a process. And as customers get comfortable coming back into the restaurants, as customers kind of evolve in kind of this post-COVID world, like just trying to feel out what's going to happen. And if you try and kind of over-engineer a process right now, odds are it's going to change. And so you really want to make sure that you're remaining flexible throughout this process.
Yeah, I love that, because a lot of times people look at tools, right, as the solution. But at the end of the day, like, you don't buy a hammer to have a hammer. You buy a hammer because you need a nail put into the right place, right?
Yeah, and super important with tools, kind of pre and post-COVID world, of having a really solid underlying process. Actually, the technology can enable and support and make it much more efficient and help streamline the operation, rather than having the tool to kind of drive the process. Because then oftentimes you get in a situation where people get frustrated, it's not easy to use, it's cumbersome, and you really don't think through that process, and then you just keep replacing system over system because you're not getting the desired outcome that you want. And I've seen it happen far too many times with especially some of the restaurant tools.
Yeah, and in the startup world, we have the concept of an MVP, a minimal viable product, meaning what is the least that we can do to see if something works, to validate it. And with that MVP concept, you start off with paper and pencil. You start off with a Word document, with a PowerPoint presentation. You start off with something that's really simple to see, does the flow work before you go and build a technology or find a technology to make that work. The most complicated tools sitting on top of an unstructured process means that, no matter how sophisticated the tool is, you're not going to get the desired outcome, right? Like Stephen Covey says, start with the end in mind.
I think it's important to have that end in mind because you always want a North Star to go after. But if you try and engineer and design to the North Star from day one, you're never gonna make it to market. You're never gonna make it into the restaurant operation because you're gonna be chasing kind of perfection all the time, and perfection doesn't exist.
Yeah, that's a great point. How have you seen in your career people overthinking technology?
Yeah, I mean, I think we look at it is, again, everybody wants the end state from the beginning, and you overthink it as you try and come up with kind of all the happy path is the way to go, and you try and come up with all the exceptions and all kind of the outlier cases, and you try day one to build for the outliers. And odds are, once you figure out an outlier, another one's going to show up. And I think the other thing too is when you look at what I think the startup world and kind of the innovations that tech have brought is this more kind of iterative kind of sprint mindset instead of, like you said, the MVP. Instead of kind of the waterfall kind of traditional development cycles, because where I've seen things fail over time is you build your requirements, engineers go away for a couple months, come back, and nobody ever gets it right the first time. And so when those business users see it on paper after a couple months of engineering, it's nothing like they wanted it to work like, and then you kind of start the process over. And so what gets designed on paper is never reality. And so super important to go through that. And then I think the other thing too is, change is difficult. I mean, it's one of the hardest things. And, in my teams respectively throughout my career, probably the biggest thing is, I tended to, the technology is not necessarily always the hard part. It's the change and the implementation that's the hard part because you're changing behaviors.
Yeah.
And so trying to figure out, and it's kind of something I would laugh about with my teams of the kind of Kelly emotional change cycle is like feedback on day one of a change or a system implementation isn't really all that relevant. And so you got to figure out kind of that curve of where people get used to the new norm and then kind of settle into the new norm. But if you open up the change request from day one, people are, basing that more on emotion and what they used to do and haven't really changed the habit. So super important to kind of get through that kind of habit breaking cycle before you start to go, rip everything up and start over again.
That's a great point because especially on the other side of things, if you're not building tech and you're buying tech and there's one little thing that you really want it to do and that piece of technology doesn't do it, what happens is a lot of times people will, I've seen in situations where they will totally abandon a technology that has 99% of what it wants, but because it doesn't do this feature this way, they build it. I was a part of a large international nonprofit organization. They really wanted a certain process a certain way because they thought that was most effective, but there was a technology that they were looking to buy that could have streamlined it and had a different process that was more effective, but they couldn't get around the fact that there was a different way to do it. And so one of the things I learned working advertising in New York was that there is always a better way. Absolutely. And so don't overthink your technology, and the converse of that, right, is don't be afraid of changes. Right?
Yeah.
There could be a better way to
process, right? And there's a better process, right? And there's always that process. But again, I think change is the hardest part of anything that we do, and getting people to kind of change. I come into work one day and do it one way and do it another way, and I've been doing it, all these years, which I think leads into a good, discussion about the new norm. Is operators used to operating in a way. And this has really become an inflection point because it's going to force people to change the way they operate, right? And some of those kind of sacred ways of doing business with inside the four walls, or the way they operated kind of pre-COVID, everybody's kind of starting with a clean slate because everybody's trying to figure out how to evolve with the change in really customer behaviors and kind of the new kind of conditions that we're working in of how their operations kind of fit into that new norm.
So as part of like the technology and the operations, a second point that we had talked about was about analytics and automation, right? Mm-hmm. This concept of how technology meets hospitality. And, you said something really interesting to me, which is basically, if we have learned anything from COVID-19, it's that good analytics and automation are no longer optional. And that really stuck out to me. Tell me about your thoughts around that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important because the only way to kind of evolve and really understand what's happening in the operation, and whether it be from an internal operation perspective or from a guest perspective, is having strong data, right? I grew up in restaurants, and it was always that, the mantra was always cash is king. Uh-huh. But I think data is a close second to that, right? Because the only way to drive your business forward is by having actionable information that you can really make a decision and influence change off of. And then I think automation is the other part of it. Is as you go into this really kind of complex omni-channel world, I think automation in some of the processes within the restaurant, freeing up managers' times to really focus on the guest is important. So any kind of manual repetitive tasks, super important. And then as you go into the omni-channel, what we've talked about before is, really kind of finding where I think integrations then become absolutely critical, and having this kind of seamless flow of data across the organization so that the right information was with the right team member, the guest, the back of the house, the front of the house, employees, kind of throughout that customer journey to make sure that they're providing that right service for the guest, and be able to make decisions based on that information.
And this concept of personalization, right? The right decision for the guests. What, back in the day, 6 months ago, you could walk up to a table, talk to them, engage with the guest, and it really was a guest. And now what we're hearing is a lot of people, because it's no longer within the four walls, their philosophy is changing from they're not a guest anymore coming into your house where you're serving them, but they're a customer. It's a very transactional thing. And so how do you still leverage that personalization?
So I think it's interesting because if you look at it, the important part is to understand your guest and be able to tailor that experience, because everybody's going to be at a kind of a different level of comfort as they're coming into the restaurants, right? And so it really, it's been talked about in retail and some other industries for a long time, but really this concept of any model from a consumer is super important, because you need to understand your guest, because they're going to have to want to interact with you in different ways. Some people might still be comfortable and want that kind of one-to-one touch experience in the restaurant. Some people might want to come into a restaurant and not want to talk to anybody and order themselves, but still sit at the table and have somebody serve them. And then obviously kind of outside the four walls into kind of delivery and pickup and curbside and all those other kind of channels are equally as important. So you have to give the guest choice to interact with you on their terms, going back to that contract you talked about earlier on, not necessarily on the terms of the restaurant.
Yeah, and I think that you're exactly right, that there's going to be this staggered approach. And quite frankly, there's going to be, people that we used to consider maybe a little bit OCD on things, literally, or just like in the, pejorative sense of the word. But, we may, that for a lot of people is the new normal, right? There are some people that are totally fine. Like I went to the grocery store the other day and there were people walking around, no masks, right up next to you. And it's like, hey, I don't know if you've heard,
but hello.
But it's going to take a long time for that to go back to normal. And like you were saying, it's going to be different, and it's going to be phased. And just like nowadays, you go to a website and you can chat with someone, you can Facebook message with someone, you can call, you could email, and people have those different levels of comfort. In a restaurant, a lot of times for some of the purists, if you will, you would go into the restaurant and you order, and there's like the one way to order, there's the one way to do things. And I think you're right in terms of communicating and giving that optionality to those customers, because this new normal, it's not a threshold we cross. It's more of like a sunset, right? It's like it's a gradual change.
And the challenge is, like, over time, and probably if you look at it from restaurants, throughout the rest of kind of different industries, have been a little bit somewhat of a laggard from a technology and a tech stack perspective, and being able to enable those experiences cross-channel, right? And so, restaurants are going to fight a little bit on some legacy investments that they had, and really trying to get their, some of the older systems out there to be able to adapt to this new norm. And so this is like a prime time for kind of a reevaluation of your technology within the restaurants, and really kind of what that means, and how you change it to be able to make sure that you're, putting in a stack that's kind of flexible and kind of meets the needs of kind of the new customer demands that are coming.
And part of that new customer demand is a word that you mentioned earlier, which is omni-channel, which is another huge key point. So talk to us, what does omni-channel mean for maybe someone who hasn't heard that before, or maybe someone who thinks they know what it means? How would you define omni-channel?
Yeah, it's really about, coming in, sales coming in from different channels, whether that's third-party deliveries, your own apps. It's outside of kind of your means of your traditional business model, and what you're used to doing. Even curbside within a restaurant is not something that probably everybody was equipped to do, and people are scrambling to figure that out, right? And so I think there's a couple parts of that, is making sure, as you open up these new kind of channels within your restaurant, you got to remember all these orders are coming into a funnel, and you still have the same kind of back of the house constraints. And so really figuring out the intelligence and going back to the integrations and really automation within there is, are you kind of throttling orders to make sure that you're not getting, a 1,000 orders at once that's going to blow up a kitchen? And then you think about like integrations. We've all seen the pictures of it, and it was, pre-COVID, and now as kind of third-party delivery was kind of taking off in the industry of tablet hell in the restaurants, right? And so staff are trying to manage kind of all these different channels coming in through, 5 or 6, 3, 5, however many, different tablets for these third-party aggregators coming in, which just puts a huge operational burden, in the restaurants. And so really, a lot of work doing on the front end from a guest-facing technology, but equally as important is making sure your back of the house, kind of your in-restaurant procedures and systems, and everything's ready to handle kind of these new demand channels that are coming in, to make sure that in the end that you're really delivering a consistent guest experience.
Now, do you think that that's sustainable, this omni-channel approach? Do you think there's going to be a consolidation? Or do you think it's gonna stay fairly fragmented?
I mean, you're starting to see the you're starting to see the consolidation, right? We're seeing it within kind of the delivery partners themselves. But, in terms of kind of digital sales, I think you're going to continue to see a shift of, kind of traditional brick and mortar sales kind of pushing out into the digital sales. I was reading a really interesting article. I forgot where it was, but again, it goes back to what we were talking earlier about behaviors of, with implementing new technology, but same with, behaviors of customers. And so during this COVID time, customer habits are changing as well too. And so, there probably will be a percentage of people that even when the restaurants are safe to go open, they've developed a new habit now of ordering through some of these kind of alternative ordering methods, and those will stick, right? Because people now are used to it. And so that kind of leads into some of the new norm. And so you'll continue to see kind of the push in that movement.
And I think that something that you said earlier was meeting the customer where they're at.
Yep.
Because customers are coming at you from all different ways, from, social media, from online, from these third-party deliveries. They're wanting to pick up in store, they're wanting to pick up curbside, they're wanting it to be delivered contactless. Like, you have all of these different, operational components to it. And and you've really got to meet those customers where they're at, because if you ignore one of those customer bases and say, oh, we don't want to do delivery, well, that's a great opportunity for someone else who's down the street who may not be as good as you, but they're more convenient. And that omni-channel approach, I feel like convenience is a huge part of this new contract that customers are demanding of restaurants, that they kind of, get with it, technologically speaking.
Absolutely, 100% agree. Right? You have to be present where they want to be present. Otherwise, they're going to go somewhere else, right? Because if I'm going to order delivery and you're not on that channel, odds are I'm not going to go hunt you down somewhere else. I'm going to go to the next option within one of the delivery providers that's going to bring me what I want to look for, right? And so
yeah, exactly.
It's super important.
So, by the way, why do you think restaurants historically have been a little bit more of a laggard when it comes to technology?
I think it's just somewhat of the industry, and I think it goes back to that contract we talked about, right? The business model within restaurants hasn't really changed a great deal. If you think about it in the drive-through in QSR, it hasn't changed in 20, don't quote me on the years, but 20 some plus years. The experience has been the same, right? And so there really has always been kind of this kind of laggard viewpoint. And also, it's innovation within the restaurant space. And so I think in the last few years, you've really started to see kind of this emergence of, kind of tech coming into the restaurant space, and, clearly a couple, big brands leading the way in that space as well too.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that technology has enabled us to do is companies like Ovation, right? Where we're able to really get more actionable with that guest feedback. And now that table touches are needing to go digital, and people aren't wanting that confrontation, and it's too much of a hassle and awkward. So talk to us about how guest feedback plays a role in this new normal with technology.
Yeah, I mean, it's really about that personal connection, right? And I think we go back to that kind of new norm experience, and the way for operators to get through is to really understand and know their guests, and having that feedback of, what's working, what's not working. But also, guest expectations have changed significantly, right? And so prior, when you talk about guests, back in, way back when we designed our first guest survey program long ago, when I was with Hard Rock, that was just, kind of the new norm, was tying the transaction code on the bottom of the receipt, somebody going afterwards and getting a small sample of people to do a survey, and getting the feedback that way and building it. There was really no expectation of the customer to have kind of this real-time kind of feedback loop, happening. And I think that's changed, and customer expectations have changed. And so they have a need for kind of real-time feedback, because you get it, like you said, I can go online to, chatbots or what have you, and get instant access to information, or file a complaint and have somebody respond right away. And their expectations are the same in the restaurant. And so it's super important to have that real-time feedback, to be able to kind of continue to kind of change and adapt to this new norm.
Yeah, we did a survey, and we asked, how do you want to feel when you have submitted feedback to a company? And the number one response we got back was they want to feel heard. And so often we just, like, people don't feel heard when and it's made them kind of lose faith in some of those survey tools, right? Because why would I waste my time and, fill out these 75 questions if I'm never going to get a response back? Nothing's going to change.
Yeah.
And that report is going to get, filed up through a whole series of filters to the CEO once a month, right? Like, what does that do for me as a consumer?
And I think it's important. I think we talk about personalization, right? And people, like you said, want to be heard. People want to feel valued. And people, want to feel important. And so when you combine those three, of having that kind of real-time feedback, and being able to open up and having those engaging dialogues with the customer, super important from an operations perspective, from a guest recovery perspective, from an understanding what's happening in the operation. And again, I go back to having that data to be able to then kind of adjust and adapt to some of the new norms that are coming out as part of kind of this post-COVID world.
Yeah, one of my favorite books that you and I have talked about numerous times is Danny Meyer, his just incredible book, Setting the Table. And in there, he talks about two things that really stood out to me as I read that. Was one, he said, business, like life, is all about how you make people feel. And then he also said that hospitality is a dialogue. Mm-hmm. And in this new digital omni-channel world, it's so critical that we maintain that dialogue and that we maintain it's about how you make people feel, right?
So absolutely. I mean, I was just talking to somebody. I happen to enjoy wine. And so I think we've all been, and people, I'll relate it to wine and some experiences of wine tastings, right? And, you could have the best wine in the world when you walk into a winery. And if the experience is not good, the wine suddenly doesn't taste as good. And you don't create that affinity to that wine and kind of, when you start to become a repeat customer, because that dialogue, that experience will kind of override some of your taste buds and some of the, the other things.
It sours the experience, right?
It does sour the experience, right? So super important. And I think that translates across kind of everything that we do, right? That dialogue is super important.
And you recently had an experience with a third-party delivery that turned pretty sour, right?
It was horrible. Like, I got the wrong food. I didn't know who to call. I called the restaurant. They told me to call the delivery provider. I was on the chat bot. The tools were effective, but it took me over an hour and a half to get them to credit me my $10, I think it was a smoothie that I never got, right?
And all I'm saying is this.
It was just a hassle.
Kelly McPherson has better things to do with her time than take an hour or whatever to get $10 back. I mean, that's ridiculous, right?
Yeah, and I couldn't fault the restaurant, but their response was, you have to call the delivery provider, right? And so, it was very challenging. So yeah, and probably now I won't order from that restaurant, just because, not necessarily because I've had a bad experience with them before, but it just left a sour taste in my mouth, as you said.
And I think that's so unfortunate that a lot of times with this omni-channel approach, there's, the new normal. The fact is that it's new. And like you talked about, there's changes. Things are going to be different, which means new processes, which means bumps in the road. I mean, everyone can remember going to a restaurant opening day. If you're lucky, it's a disaster, yep. Right?
Exactly.
And I've been to opening restaurants and talking to my friends opening restaurants where the point of sale goes down, and it's like, well, what are you gonna do? It's like, yep. Cash only. Sorry, right?
Yeah.
So these things happen, but the problem is when it goes outside the four walls, regardless of who's delivering, it's still the brand that I'm ordering from that takes
exactly.
the hit.
And the brand still needs to, and I think like anything, you got to be careful not to use the delivery parties as an excuse, because at the end of the day, people are still going to go back to the delivery partner because of the marketplace of all the different restaurants. And so, back to my experience, I'm singling out the restaurant based on the experience I had from the delivery provider. So, super important to kind of own that customer experience end to end, even if you don't have control over it.
Exactly. I couldn't have said it better myself. In fact, I mean, isn't that why that's why I started Ovation?
Exactly.
Awesome. Kelly, this has been super informative, very interesting. Love the conversation. So my key takeaways are, one, don't overthink the technology. Use the technology for the solution, the outcome, not as the outcome. Mm-hmm. 2, good analytics and automation are no longer optional. 3, utilize an omni-channel approach, because if you don't capture those customers, someone else is going to come in and steal them. And then 4, guest feedback really being key in that omni-channel approach to own that guest experience.
Correct. 100%. You got it right.
Awesome. Kelly, thank you so much for joining us on this special edition of Give An Ovation. How can people find you, follow you online?
Yeah, the biggest part is on LinkedIn. If anybody, just connect with me, and would love to start to network and get to know people.
Awesome. Kelly, thank you for coming on. Thank you for all of your help and for helping push this industry forward. We've come a long ways from those receipt surveys back in the 90s, and so grateful that, we've been able to stand on the shoulders of giants, of, pioneers such as yourself, to really help bring guest feedback into this new normal. So thank you.
Thanks, Zach. Really appreciate it.
Glad you're with us today, and thank you. Thank you to the risk takers, the troublemakers, the crazies who are keeping this world clothed and fed. You're the ones who deserve an ovation. Again, this podcast was sponsored by Ovation. To see how we can help you grow your business, go to ovationup.com. Don't forget to subscribe, and as always, remember to give someone in your life an ovation today.